All right, thanks very much, Susan. I'm going to share my screen. And okay, thanks, Katie. I appreciate that. So good morning, everyone. Thanks, Susan, for the introduction. As mentioned, my name is Laura Qualey, and I'm a Regional Transportation Planner at Greater Portland Council of Governments, also known as GPCOG. And I'm joined today with Cashel, another planner, and he'll talk about micromobility, and I'll start off by talking about transit. So I wanted to ground us in the regional transit vision and also the vision of One Climate Future as pertains to transit. So some of you may be familiar that One Climate Future has some public transit strategies and actions for Portland, South Portland. And those align really well with the goals of our regional plans, which are Transit Tomorrow, the region's long-range plan for public transportation, and Transit Together, which is a more recent study focusing on some shorter-term implementation of our long-range goals. So really good to know that we have that shared vision, and we want to think about transit both like within each community, but also how it connects as a region. So digging a little bit deeper in One Climate Future, there are 3 public transit focus areas. One is to make transit easier. So for instance, making it easier to pay your fare and know how that works in an app or a tap card. Some of those changes have already been coming into play over the last several years, but we want to keep moving forward, keep up with technology and basic amenities to make it easier to ride transit. Also expanding local connections, so that means improving frequency and reliability and availability of connections both within Portland, South Portland, and to other communities. And also introduce rapid transit. That is a specific type of transit, and One Climate Future calls out more specifically bus rapid transit to be able to have really high frequency, high capacity bus service on some corridors. So think every 10-15 minutes a bus coming by, and this is my cat Dudley, classic Zoom, bus coming by, and with its own dedicated lanes and transit signal priority, you would be really, really clear that there's this bus coming on and you can get to some really priority centers really fast. All right, so as I said before, that aligns really, really well and purposefully with Transit Tomorrow, our region's long-range public transportation plan. So looking out through 2050. The first 3 goals are pretty much the same: make transit easier, create frequent connections, and invest in rapid transit. I'll add that Transit Tomorrow specifically envisions 4 rapid transit corridors. The first you may have heard about, we did a study on that wrapped up this year, and now is over at Greater Portland Metro for implementation and more planning. And that's between Gorham, Westbrook, and Portland. There are other corridors that go north, south, and east. And the one that goes furthest east would connect South Portland to Portland and then out to Wyndham. And finally, the 4th goal is to create transit-friendly places. So thinking about how can we improve our zoning and encourage plans that create really dense communities with mixed use, where it's easier to walk, bike, and take transit reliably. All right, so last year we completed a study called Transit Together that focused on those first 2 goals: make transit easier and create frequent connections. In particular, that study looked to increase the coordination and integration across the region's transit network and improving efficiency amongst our several providers and creating a cohesive system for riders. It started out with a state of the system review, like where are all our routes, what are the frequencies, who are we serving, and then started to dig into, where's the demand, population, and jobs, and places where people need to get to, like healthcare and grocery stores. And how can we better align our network design to demand, and also thinking about what's feasible with available resources. funding. So that led to two major outputs of the system of the plan. The one is a recommended service plan that outlines a network, particularly a bus network that best matches the demand for transit with the provision of transit service. And then several regional initiatives, which are opportunities to improve the rider experience or increase administrative efficiencies through enhanced interagency collaboration, coordination, and integration. So from things like, how do we maybe have a more cohesive brand across all of our transit providers in the region? Or how do we have a regional fare payment policy so you know you can pay the same way across multiple different modes or providers? And then also things like purchasing electric buses, multiple agencies coming together to purchase electric buses. Okay, so this was the outcome of that first part, the recommended service plan. And it is a lot of information here, of course, and that's one thing I wanted to highlight was that we have quite a large regional network that really helped highlight the fact that we needed to have this increased integration and coordination to make sure that we were aligning different bus routes properly, figuring out where we could increase frequency, and like I said, placing demand with service. So another thing I want to point out here was that there's several communities involved, Portland, South Portland, up to Falmouth, and some service up through Brunswick, far west as far as Bridgeton, which isn't shown on the map, but that's the Lakes Region Explorer bus. Lots more bus service in Westbrook and Scarborough, and then down to Biddeford, Saco, Old Orchard Beach. So on a high level, some other takeaways from that recommended service plan are it's really about serving the most people and serving the people that need it most. And as a result, improving access. So where previously a status quo of our system, there was no bus service that was 20-minute or better frequency. And this plan recommends that in some routes where possible, and also improving service so that all but one route would be faster than every 60 minutes. And at the same time, making sure that we can serve the people who need it most, in particular low-income populations, who are people who tend to be the most reliant on transit, such as having no vehicles in their household. Okay, so now over to the regional initiatives, which was a lot more diverse than just like that network design. I want to start by saying that it's been guided by public feedback heard over the years, actually in addition to the service plan. So both from public engagement for Transit Together, Transit Tomorrow, and previous plans, we've heard that our communities want faster service, more frequent service, better transfers, and many other things. So we've tried to integrate all of that feedback into these regional initiatives. Some highlights from those regional initiatives are coming up with a regional standard for family of services. So what does it look like? Like, how do we define, what a local bus is versus an express bus? And then thinking about bus rapid transit in our future. Improving the amenities and accessibility of transit stops and hubs. Making fare payment easier, making it easier to look at, your app and figure out trip planning, either just on the bus or across multiple modes. Faster, more reliable and sustainable transit, which includes transition to hybrid and electric vehicles. And then establishing a regional microtransit program. I know Mike will get into that, but in short, it's on-demand public transit. So you can call up a ride anywhere within a specific service zone and be able to go door to door. And now I will pass it over to Cashel for micromobility.
Great. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about micromobility and more broadly about how our transit system interacts with the rest of our transportation system and some of the things planners think about besides everything Laura just talked about, ways to make our transit system better for people. You want to hit the next slide? So what is micromobility? Interesting word for sure. Transportation using small human-powered or electric-powered devices. You could think bikes, skateboards, roller skates, scooters, even segways. Also electric-powered things, so e-bikes, electric mopeds. Those one wheels, I guess, are electric. So those all fit in that category. And I like this graphic a lot, but it doesn't include adaptive micromobility devices. So for older adults, individuals with disabilities, there are adaptive devices that work well for them. And also pictured there, those sort of seem like they're gas mopeds. Some people would include gas mopeds and scooters in this category. Sort of depends who you ask, but they tend to have really, really good gas mileage and sort of fit a lot of the same benefits and categories that the rest of them do. So up to you on that one. But so the greatest benefits here of micromobility are that they're small, speedy, and affordable, and all of that makes them an excellent pair with transit. So small, they're easy to store, and they're easy to pack up. They're easy to park. So, I mean, the top row there, you could probably fold any of those and hop right onto transit. They're easy to park, so they just take up less room. And that means for towns and cities and states, alleviates the cost of having parking, as much parking anyway, alleviates maintaining infrastructure like roads, and it can alleviate traffic congestion as well. They're speedy, so I mean, mostly this is comparing it with walking, which of course is a great way to get around, some people's preferred way of getting around, but walking doesn't get you anywhere particularly quickly, so these offer people an opportunity to get around quickly. You know, we could spend all day talking about e-bikes and the promise there, but they are, in general, a quick and efficient way of getting around. They're also affordable. We know that cars are very expensive to maintain and to own, and micromobility really gives people an option that's, you know, fits into their tight budgets. And you know, you might pay up to a couple grand for an e-bike or a moped, maybe a little bit more. But once you have it too, you know, it doesn't really have much of a maintenance or registration cost, which is, you know, what will sink your money away with cars. And yeah, they really pair well with transit. In some cases, you're able to take them right onto the bus, train, or ferry. You can park a scooter or bike right at the transit stop if the amenities allow, and hop right onto transit. And it gives people an option for their first and last mile from the transit stop, which I'll cover a little bit more on the next slide. I also wanted to mention that they often are part of the sharing economy. And so that can really make things even more affordable for people not having to buy a bike, but using, say, Portland Bike Share, which has been a great addition to Portland's mobility options for people. It's cheap to use, available throughout the peninsula. And yeah, people don't have to buy a bike. They can just essentially borrow one or share one with others. Next slide. So yeah, first and last mile connections, with the exception of some door-to-door transit services and microtransit in some instances, everyone who uses transit also has to get from their origin to the transit stop and then from the transit stop to their destination. And that's what we call first and last mile connections. Basically means you're a walker, a biker, a roller at some point in your trip if you're taking transit. And we sometimes call or refer to people that are doing that as vulnerable road users because they are inherently less safe than those in cars and trucks. Because of essentially cars and trucks, we mix everyone into our system together, and it creates you know, danger for people without metal protection around them. So anyway, everyone's a vulnerable road user, and that makes it all the more important to have a safe system around transit. And transit only works if people can access those transit stops and make their way safely to and from the transit stop. So that comes in a lot of forms, and there's a lot that goes into feeling safe and actually being safe and having it be convenient as well. So I list a few things there, but the transit stops themselves need to be accessible. Sidewalks and pedestrian crossings need to be there and robust. Bike facilities, parking for micromobility devices, lighting, all of those things go into, making first and last mile connections work for people. Next slide. All right, I'll talk just briefly and then let us get on to Mike's and the merger, which I'm sure people are interested to hear about. But we have a number of initiatives that I work on with GBCOG that are about improving access and road safety for people, and it all works into a transit system that works for people. So the first one's Complete Streets, which is an approach to planning and designing streets that enables safe access for all users and uses. The important thing with Complete Streets is to catch planners and designers, whoever it may be, early in the process of planning, to ensure that we're considering all users and uses in a particular section of street. And so we do that in a number of ways, but one example is the South Portland Street Design Manual, which was passed last year. And this builds off South Portland's Complete Streets policy, which commits the city to considering all users. And really the manual provides context and direction to planners and designers specific to South Portland. Portland doesn't have something quite like that. They have a technical manual which has some street design elements, but generally their planners and designers defer to best practices guides nationally and use those to help design them. We also are starting a regional Complete Streets guidebook, which will help all the communities in our region design for complete streets, and also provide some guidance on how it plugs into the planning process. Vision Zero is a commitment to 0 deaths and serious injuries on our streets. And a lot of communities have started using this as a framing device because it centers safety in our decision-making around streets. The region has a Vision Zero action plan. And in that action plan, we identified a number of critical safety corridors and intersections in our region that need to be improved, and also identifies a number of actions that can be taken to get to 0 deaths and serious injuries. I'll just call out that Yarmouth recently passed a Vision Zero resolution that I know Mike played a role in, and that's the first town in Maine to do so, and that'll open them up to the broader Vision Zero network nationally and globally, and just shows that they're committed to making their streets safer. Safe Streets for All, that's another term you might hear kicked around. This is actually a grant that the Federal Highway Administration recently started doing, and it stemmed from the bipartisan infrastructure law and appropriated $5 billion over 5 years for safety-oriented projects. There wasn't much precedent for this, so it's pretty exciting. And it's what GBCOG used to construct the Vision Zero action plan, and we've gotten other grants to actually fund and implement safety improvements from that plan. And there's a couple other grants pending that we're waiting to hear back from, but that money's been flowing from that grant. So Safe Streets for All. And to bring it all together is the Transit Stop Access Project, which is a project between GBCOG, Maine DOT, all the transit agencies, and the communities in the region to improve transit stop accessibility directly. It's had a few phases over the years. And so the first phase looked at the system as a whole and identified high priority bus stops for accessibility improvements. It looked at some locations of transit mini hubs and also provided some ideas for cycle and pedestrian facility improvements to implement within a half mile of existing transit stops. So essentially first and last mile improvements. Phase 2 further refined the list of improvements and started conceptual design. And then phase 3, which we're in right now, takes those conceptual designs and runs them through environmental and historical review, which can take a while, and then puts together preliminary and final design plans and starts to coordinate construction. So phase 4 will be the construction, and it's slated right now for 2025 and 2026. And it's dozens and dozens of transit stops throughout the region that are going to see improvements. So that's exciting, and I'll cut myself off there and pass it over to Mike.
All right, thanks, Cashel and Laura. I'm Mike Tremblay. I am the Director of Transit Development at Greater Portland Metro, and I will share now. All right. So a little bit of an introduction to Metro for those who don't know who we are or where we operate. We have 8 member communities. We operate in Portland, Westbrook, Falmouth, Yarmouth, Freeport, Brunswick, and this year we welcomed Gorham formally into the district. We had been running the Husky line out to Gorham, out to USM since I believe 2018 or so, and they formally joined the district this year as a member community. And South Portland joined last month and will be taking over operations of their routes in December. And so I'll get into a lot more of that later on in the presentation. Our regional map, I apologize if this is tricky to read, but I think the key takeaways here are that we serve all of those communities along the major corridors. About over a dozen regional routes actually converge into downtown Portland. So all these routes are sort of centric into downtown Portland. And that includes South Portland's routes as well as a few routes coming from Biddeford, Saco, and Old Orchard Beach, as well as the Lakes Region Explorer, which Laura mentioned, going out to Bridgeton. The Breeze service goes out to Yarmouth, Freeport, and Brunswick on an express basis. So jumping on the highway and making that trip as fast as possible. Otherwise, our services are generally considered local routes, except for the Husky line, which is limited stop. Stops every mile or two in order to make that trip pretty fast between Gorham and Portland, between the 2 USM campuses. Another thing to point out is that in the main mall area, there's 5 different transit routes that converge there, including one from Biddeford, Saco, Old Orchard Beach, 2 of Metro's routes, and then 2 of the South Portland routes that Metro will begin operating next month. Just a little bit of more information. This is a climate-focused discussion, so I wanted to get a little bit of insight on this. We have 49 buses in our fleet. That's post-merger number. We're running up against our facility limits here. We have a 50 bus facility. We'll have about 49 buses. So if we start to think about how we might be able to expand service here in the next few years, it might be a little bit tricky to do so. We'll have to find some creative solutions to do that. But we're really hoping to expand our facility to make it a 50-year facility that can almost double the amount of, or more than double the amount of buses we have in our fleet by the end of the decade here, or allow us to expand in the future, I should say. 2 of those buses are battery electric. We introduced those a couple of years ago. Our board has committed to an emissions-free fleet by 2040. That number is actually pretty important because our buses typically have a 14-year lifespan. So in order to ensure that we'll have an emissions-free fleet by 2040, we probably need to start procuring exclusively emissions-free buses by 2026 or 2027. And so that'll be coming up here real soon. And so we'll start to see a lot more, probably battery electric, but future technologies are also on the table in terms of emissions-free fleet by then as well. And then one other thing is that ridership in Metro's network rose in the 2010s after decades of stagnation. This is important because these are trips that might otherwise be driving. Fewer, at least taking those passenger miles off of single occupancy vehicles and putting those into transit. And we're hoping to continue to recover after the pandemic and hopefully exceed those 2019 numbers soon. Laura mentioned microtransit. I don't want to spend too much time on this because I want to focus most of my time on the South Portland merger, but this could be relevant at some point in South Portland. In a week or 2 here, we hope to launch our microtransit service in Falmouth. The microtransit or on-demand transit is a kind of a new version of an old way of serving rural and suburban areas, which is an on-demand demand response we call type of service. So instead of traveling on a fixed route, there's a zone that's covered by a vehicle that goes to you when you call it. And so on the image on the right here is the Route 7, which serves Falmouth Foreside. Currently, it runs every hour or so to the areas in the dashed orange, but those are very low ridership, and because the service is relatively infrequent, who can blame folks for not wanting to rely on that service? So rather than having that low level of service, fixed route service, we're going to try this microtransit service here by the end of the month, and that'll be a 1-year pilot funded by ARPA to kind of show that microtransit can work here, and potentially could work at other areas in the region as well. Moving on to the South Portland routes, which will be my area of focus here for the rest of the presentation. There's three routes currently served by the City of South Portland's bus service: the Route 21, which is in the green, the Route 24A, which is in the red, and the Route 24B, which only runs on weekdays in the orange. And so there was about 243,000 trips last year. I believe they're on pace to be around 250,000 this year. And there's also South Portland's also served, as I mentioned previously, by 2 other routes, 2 metro routes and 1 B-Sub route. So as part of the merger, Metro has been very clear about we're not going to, on day one, change all the routes around. We want to do a lot of public outreach here. But one of the big things that we'll need to focus on is the balance between coverage and frequency. So if you look at these, conceptual service areas, right? You have 2 primary corridors that with a lot of jobs or housing along those 2 corridors, and then you have a lot of other kind of intertwining roadways with less of those transit drivers. Where do you focus if you have, say, 18 or 20 buses that you can run all day? Do you focus all your service on the major corridors, or do you spread it out and try and serve as much of the area as possible? The reality is it's probably somewhere in the middle, but this is kind of the key transit question. And considering that any transit agency has limited resources, that 18 or 20 number buses per day in this graphic, how do you allocate those? And there's certainly a good argument for either of these. So let's focus on the maximum coverage model here first. The biggest benefit of this is that pretty much everyone has access to transit, right? So you can consider everybody's paying taxes. You want everybody to make sure that they can get around without a car. Let's make sure we spread those buses around and make sure that anybody can get into the center of town on a bus. It also is helpful, as Cashel was talking about the need for safe sidewalks and crosswalks. If your city or town doesn't have a complete pedestrian network, this level of coverage-based service can be helpful because you're not forcing people to walk a quarter mile on a roadway with no sidewalks. And so this can be a pretty key benefit for those types of communities. However, the drawbacks are longer travel times, right? You get on the bus and the bus has to deviate down into different neighborhoods. Rather than a 20-minute ride into downtown, it could be a 40-minute ride. And for folks who are have other options, who have access to a car, that might be a deal breaker for taking transit if it's going to be that much longer to get to your destination. But it also means that because you're spreading out that service throughout your whole area, the level of frequency on any one corridor is going to be pretty low. You have to distribute those vehicles around, and so your wait times between buses are going to be pretty low. And that generally means lower ridership across the board. And so that's sort of you might make that trade-off knowing that at least everybody can get to where they're going if they need to, but you're generally going to have lower ridership. And with lower ridership, it means it's going to cost more money to operate these services. You have less money coming in from fare revenue, and you might have more capital costs because of all the bus stops you have to build. And so you have a higher cost per trip, and that's a pretty significant metric in any transit agency. I mentioned this because South Portland, I think it's pretty fair to say, has a pretty coverage-based model now. You can see how the 24A and 24B sort of go out of their way off of the Broadway corridor to pick up more folks in the neighborhoods. And really the main mall area with all the different big box businesses and stuff that need that need service. That takes a lot of time out of the travel time of these routes. And so perhaps there's some discussion about how much coverage we have on these routes, and maybe we can convert some of that coverage into frequency. On the flip side, a maximum ridership model focuses all those services along the major corridors. It's as direct as possible. A lot of times we get requests for, hey, can you bring the bus into my development or down my subdivision? And the answer to that would always be no in this situation. No deviations. And this means that trips are more frequent, they're faster. Because of that, the ridership's higher and the cost per trip is low. You can see that, a lot of neighborhoods wouldn't have direct coverage and they'd have to walk longer to their bus stops. And so that's really difficult for some folks to be able to handle, especially if they have mobility needs. And so that's why I think some level of balance is needed here. So just looking again at South Portland's coverage, and I wanted to dip back into what Transit Together, which Laura talked about earlier, proposed for South Portland. In the dashed red lines is actually service coverage that was proposed to be removed. The primary coverage on the Route 24, which you'll note is combined into one singular service as opposed to two different services, is primarily focused on Broadway, with much less of the kind of deviating you see around the main mall, and actually turning around the Mill Creek Transit Hub rather than going into Portland, and focusing on a much more frequent and direct service between downtown Portland and Mill Creek. And so because of these changes to coverage, you can run these routes much more frequently. That connection in Mill Creek to get over the bridge is much less painful. That's an actual, you can make that connection relatively painlessly because the Route 21 is coming every 20 minutes. And so, rather than waiting 2 hours for an hour for a bus that brings you to downtown Portland, you might only have to wait 20 minutes for that bus and then transfer in Mill Creek. And so my understanding from the previous bus directors, discussions with the public on this plan is that there was a lot of concern about the loss of coverage here. And I'm not surprised by that, but the obvious benefits here would be, more direct service and faster service. So some of the things we'll consider here as we take ownership of those routes and start to consider how we might improve service. We're going to collect a whole bunch of data, stop level data, see where people are getting on, see where people are getting off, calculate that cost per trip at each of those, deviations and bus stops, and make the case for if there's areas where, ridership is really low and it's costing a lot of time and money to go serve those areas, then maybe there's some service consolidations that could be made there. We're not going to do this without a lot of public outreach for both existing bus passengers, but also people who don't take the bus, right? There's two sides to the story. Oftentimes we focus on the people who are already riding, but there's going to be a lot of folks that the existing transit network just doesn't work for. Even if the bus goes right by their house, it's only going by their house every 2 hours. And so we want to talk to those folks as well to see what it would take to get them to switch to transit. Similar to Transit Together, we want to improve the frequency of that east-west service. We've tossed around the idea of turning one of those 224 routes into more of a express, while the other one continues to pick up local trips. We've also heard from the community that direct connections to SMCC's campus, which is currently served only by the Route 21, might be beneficial to the Route 24 as well. And then, as I mentioned, if there's anywhere where coverage could be reduced to enhance that speed, is that's something we will consider as well. When we have additional funding, I think that microtransit could play a key role in replacing that coverage, that any coverage that's removed by the frequency improvements. Microtransit could play a huge role there. It would also potentially allow us to expand to even more destinations than is currently served by the fixed route. We've also tossed around the idea of a mall area circulator. This is shown on the right in the purple line. So rather than having one of the fixed routes that runs all the way, east-west across the city, serve all of the businesses in the mall area. Maybe there's a little mini hub in the main mall, and there's a circulator that runs every half hour or so that can get people around to the different businesses, and maybe even the Jetport, maybe even Scarborough Downs in the future, rather than having that be on the fixed route corridor. Laura mentioned rapid transit. One of the rapid transit corridors identified in Transit Tomorrow is a corridor to South Portland. And so that is certainly something that we'd be excited to explore at the right time. And then this last bullet here, every summer we get requests to have service to Portland Head Light at Fort Williams Park. And also we get requests to Scarborough Downs as well. So we're always looking for that next service improvement, while also keeping in mind that our primary goal is to serve, make transit easier and faster and more direct. And so we are also trying to find that balance between expanding coverage and improving frequency and speed. So that's all I have for you. I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody may have about this or anything else that we're doing.
Thank you so much to each of our speakers. That was a lot of really great information on a wide range of topics. So I'm sure we're going to have some questions. And I saw that someone's been raising their hand for quite a while. So Orion, do you want to go ahead and ask your question? No?
Yes, sorry, thank you. I mean, I have two big questions that are somewhat connected. One is that funding, and the other is alternatives. So we have, I'm interested to hear about how you think funding might be affected with the new administration. Also interested in the idea of alternatives. I love the idea of micro transit, smaller vans, and the cost comparison benefit analysis of if you're spending $100,000 more on an EV bus versus you improve service, increase routes, you spend the same money, and you get more people to drive the bus, ride the bus, then you're taking cars off the road. And even if the bus is not electric, you're actually reducing emissions more by increasing ridership. So and then you have stuff like renewable diesel and biofuels, which are greener, cleaner liquid fuels that you could run in a conventional bus. So yeah, the cost benefit analysis of where is this money going to come from in a potential administration hostile to everything green and clean, and are there alternative ways that we can get people to ride more via microtransit or other options and optimize our routes and increase riderships, as opposed to just having an electric bus that then has potentially a shorter route because of charge times and has less ridership.
So I can certainly answer the question about kind of vehicle sizes and fuel, electric versus other fuels. So actually, the cost differential between a diesel bus and an electric bus is not $100,000. I wish it was. It's actually almost $500,000. That we're hopeful that battery technology will drive that cost down, but it's about twice as much to buy an electric bus today than a diesel bus. So there certainly is a consideration there. I will say that capital costs often have separate funding opportunities, especially zero emission vehicle, low-no grants, things like that are available for low and no emission, battery electric being one of those. So there are alternative funding sources available for those. I'll also say that operating a service is generally much more expensive than like one-time costs for buying a single bus. And so, and those buses last, 12 or 14 years. And so I think it is tempting to say that, we should be buying twice as many buses and make them diesel rather than, half as many buses that are electric. But as I mentioned in my presentation, our constraints are primarily our garage space rather than, you know, the amount of vehicles we can buy. And then even if we bought a whole bunch of diesel vehicles, we wouldn't have the operating funding to run much more service with that. So we are consciously kind of finding that balance between expanding service and expanding our fleet. Right now, we're not feeling like you know, the additional cost of battery electric buses is going to be extreme issue, but we are a little bit concerned about you know, the funding needs going forward on that. I don't have much to say about you know, what the next administration might mean for transit funding. I will say that much of our growth years in the 2010s happened between 2017 and 2020 before the pandemic. And so, you know, I don't want to necessarily have spell out doom and gloom there, but you know, hopefully those funding opportunities continue and that we'll be able to meet all these goals going forward.
Thanks. I'll just add to that, echoing what Mike said. And I guess one thing that you're really touching on, Orion, is that transit itself is a sustainable solution for transportation. That it's, if you can take transit, it's better than just taking a single occupancy vehicle. In terms of funding, there has been some broader conversations to not only have the federal formula funding, which is like, you know, looking at all the data from all the transit agencies across the region, how much service does each have, and there's a formula that says, okay, Greater Portland, this is how much you can have in federal funds. That is in statute, and I would agree with Mike that don't really expect any changes. That's been pretty the same for a while. But a broader conversation is around operating assistance, because there are caps to how much you can use federal funding to operate bus service. And so there's been some discussions at the state level or like amongst agencies across the state around increasing non-federal sources, be it from the state or other local sources.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah, Kayla.
Yes, I'm wondering if there's any consideration around parking availability or options at the areas where low frequency trips meet higher frequency trips for those that commute in, say along Route 302 or Route 100. I don't know if what I'm saying makes any sense, but you might not be able to use public transit starting in Wyndham, but maybe you could closer to the Portland area.
Yeah, you know, you're talking about essentially park and rides. We do have some park and rides along our Breeze corridor. There's a park and ride in Marginal Way in Portland. I believe there's some along Route 1 south of the city. That has not been part of our kind of work plan in terms of adding park and rides. Most, if not all, park and rides are owned and operated by Maine DOT. Correct me if I'm wrong. There's also a little bit of this, you know, how likely is it for somebody to, once they're in their own vehicle, then park their vehicle and switch to a different service? You know, potentially maybe the parking costs downtown are high enough to encourage some folks to do that, but we found that once people are in their car, it's tough to get them out and become a reliable transit rider. So one thing that the rapid transit corridor between Gorham and Portland has sort of identified as the need for a park and ride at the end of that line in Gorham, and the town of Gorham is really interested in pursuing that as part of the rapid transit project. And so, you know, you mentioned Route 302 in Wyndham. You know, that's actually one of the next rapid transit corridors identified in Transit Tomorrow. And so perhaps as these rapid transit corridors are built out, which again, can better compete with single occupancy vehicles because they have, you know, their own right of way. It's rapid service, it's fast service downtown. You know, then perhaps the idea of a park and ride to encourage people to switch modes would worth considering as part of those projects. And I think a park and ride will be heavily considered as part of that rapid transit project into Gorham. So the question of whether local routes are best served by park and rides is, I think, still up in the air.
Thank you.
Okay, it looks like Orion has another question.
Yeah, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on the unfortunate disconnect of our planning process to the integration of housing and transit, that you can't really separate the two. And you had a proposed project in South Portland, like Yard South, that wanted to create like a walkable, integrated, transit-friendly community. And really the zoning process doesn't really allow for people to think out of the box and do something integrative. You can build one building at a time, but if you try to create an integrated neighborhood, our planning process doesn't allow it. And second piece of the question is, folks in the transit world who are on the main Climate Council Transportation Working Group brought up the idea of congestion pricing, and that really the only way to have less cars in a city and have people take transit is to make it more expensive to have a car in the city. But that, even in New York City, there's political blowback on things like that would potentially offer real solutions. So interested in your thoughts on both those pieces.
I could speak a little bit to that one. Yeah, I mean, congestion pricing has just sort of been, it's been a tough one because you see the benefits or potential benefits, but there's a lot of pushback, and the New York City piece of it sort of proved that point. So it might be an uphill battle there. As far as connecting the housing and transit piece, I mean, you're sort of speaking to transit-oriented development, which a lot of communities are trying to bake into their zoning processes. It takes time. It takes a lot of time. And it's constantly straddling, like, transit works best in urban settings, but a lot of our communities are only, at best, semi-urban, and so getting that density in and having it mix with transit, it just takes a lot of time. But communities are thinking about it a lot. And one tool I've heard of communities using as well is our TIFs, tax increment financing. Essentially, it creates a TIF district in a part of the town or city that shields some of the money from development and keeps it locally for transit initiatives or transit infrastructure improvements specifically. And I know there's a few communities that have transit TIFs, but I don't know how much of that money is being spent on transit. Mike might be able to speak to that, but
yeah, sorry, Cashel, were you done?
No, I'm good. Yeah.
Yeah, I believe the Westbrook is funding their share of the Husky Line and Route 3 with the TIF district as well, and Falmouth is planning on funding their share of the ARPA funded service improvements that will hopefully become permanent after next year with TIF districts as well. Speaking to zoning, I never worked for planning with the city of Portland, but they did just pass a recode, a really significant recode in the city of Portland that identifies, I believe, a half dozen or so transit-oriented development zones, as well as eliminated parking minimums and established some parking maximums. It's really progressive zoning code in the city of Portland there. So we're really excited of seeing how that can help spur transit, both on those developments, but along the corridors that they develop on, as well as we mentioned park and rides. One of the reasons why park and rides is kind of an iffy subject is because is the highest and best use of a piece of land along a major corridor a surface parking lot? Probably not. But you might be able to generate more ridership by putting a dense housing development or job center on that piece of land. And so we're really excited to see how this helps spur transit ridership in the region, and hopefully other communities can follow suit with similar improvements to their zoning.
Troy, I see you have a question.
I do. Thank you. Really great information. Thanks everybody for sharing your slides and your information. One question I get a lot from people, a lot of time from visitors, is about when can we, or how can we make transit opportunities from the Jetport or the Portland Transportation Center, quicker and easier to access. A lot of people fly in, people have to rent a car oftentimes to get, around our region, and same from people coming on the bus. So curious if you could elaborate a little bit about plans for increasing transportation from those hubs and centers.
Yeah, so actually Transit Together identified a route to extend to the Jetport. It was actually, we actually made a change to that plan. It was identified to be the Route 1. We changed it to the Route 7. But we did extend Route 7 to the Jetport. It runs there every single trip now. The previous route that served the Jetport was the Route 5, and it sort of did it every few trips, or maybe 2 out of 3 trips. And it was mid route, so you had one of those deviations that forced everybody in the bus to sit through a long Jetport trip, and it was kind of hard to set your watch to in terms of schedule. So we extended the Route 7 there in June, and we hope to improve the frequency of that route to every half hour on weekdays by the end of the year, pending our staffing levels. In terms of serving, we get a lot of questions about, is there a direct service between Thompson's Point, where Concord Coach is, and the Amtrak station currently is, and the Jetport? Both of those locations are kind of on little peninsulas by themselves, and so it's always a tricky thing to discuss, but is that deviation off the major corridor, in this case Congress Street, worth that direct connection? Right now, you can walk between Congress and Sewell Street, but to get between several routes throughout 5, 7, and 9 to Thompson's Point. But there is no direct connection between the Jetport and PTC. And that's something we haven't taken off the table. We've had an idea of like a hub link that connects downtown Portland with Casco Bay lines, with Thompson's Point and the Jetport. Again, if we had unlimited resources, we'd do a lot of this stuff, but we're constantly kind of trying to weigh that need for direct connection between major transit hubs and keeping those trips fast and with minimizing those deviations. So no immediate plans to connect those two directly, but we are making improvements, and we hope to continue to do so.
It'd be like a half-mile ferry. That would be ideal.
Yeah, the Jetport, it's tricky because it's hard to. They have very controlled entrances to the Jetport. You can't. It'd be tricky to forge something in there. We often joke about, can we just drive right into the tarmac and serve people directly? But they don't like that over there. So.
All right, it looks like we might have time for one more question. Does anyone have any final question or thoughts that they'd like to add? All right, it doesn't look like it. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you so much to our speakers. A lot of different plans as well as resources were brought up, so we'll send a follow-up email with some more information about those. And yeah, thanks again. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for having us.
Well, thank you.